Alrighty, we are now live. So, we're talking, I think, just in general about libertarian ethics and, law and stuff like that. Did you have anything you wanted to open up with, or?
Not particularly. I've basically prepared for argumentation ethics specifically because I saw the stream and
Yeah.
it's read like argumentation ethics.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Do you want me to give, like, the steelman for argumentation ethics first, or do you want to give a critique that you have with it?
Sure, you can give the steelman if you want to.
Alright, so, basically, argumentation ethics is based within the argument from argument, which is the argument from argument particularly is just saying that, well, there are normative presuppositions in the act of arguing, which you could therefore never hope to dispute argumentatively. And the way we apply this to libertarian ethics is saying, well, one such normative presupposition is that you have self-ownership, a homestead ethic, and, it's a conflict-free way of interacting, i.e. the way to deal with these disputes is not through initiating conflict, it's through peaceful dispute resolution, essentially.
All right. Yeah, so, I mean, I have basically outlined here, I think I have about 10 problems that I see with argumentation ethics, and well, I mean, I'll just start. Because I read your lecture on argumentation ethics, and in here you say the following. Further, it has to be stated that argumentation cannot exist in a normative void. That is, there are certain norms that are presupposed in the very act of argumentation. For instance, one could not argue that argumentation is pointless. This would be called a dialectic or performative contradiction, because to argue the norm that argumentation is pointless would be contradicted by the very positing of it. So here I am curious, when one would say argumentation is pointless, what would they be saying exactly? Would they be saying a normative statement, or would they be saying a descriptive statement?
Well, pointless, that sounds kind of valued to me, at least. It's saying that, hey,
right,
there is no point in doing this,
ought,
you shouldn't bother with it, right?
yeah, we ought not to argue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so here I spot a violation of essentially the is-ought distinction when it is said that this would be a performative contradiction. So that, right, let's make this even simpler. Let's not even say we ought not to argue. Let's just say, talk about speaking. So if I said I am not speaking, that would be a genuine performative contradiction, because my performance of speaking contradicts the statement I am not speaking. But if I said I ought not to speak, then that would not be a performative contradiction, because my performance of speaking does not contradict the claim that I ought to speak.
Well, if you are speaking, then surely you must think that you ought to speak rather than not speak.
Right, exactly. Okay, so maybe I do really think that I ought to speak, but here's the problem. So it's a subjective belief, right? It's a subjective belief that I hold, which is a normative belief that I ought to speak, for example, right? But I would actually not assign the value of truth to normative statements as a moral nihilist. So, for example, you could take the normative statement, the grass ought to be green, right? If we were to assign the value of truth aptness to the statement, the grass ought to be green, then it would either have to be true that grass ought to be green, or the grass ought not to be green. And it seems to me that neither of those statements, the grass ought to be green or grass ought not to be green, are actually objectively verifiable.
Right, so something like the color of grass, that would be genuinely subjective. It's of a different sort than the ethics that we were going over with as it pertains to argumentation ethics specifically, because, you could just as well say grass ought not be green, right? You can both make sense to say, but there are some things where they don't make sense to say. It's like Hoppe goes over this in terms of economic methodology and why Austrians have it right. There are statements like, well, children prefer Burger King to McDonald's. You can just as reasonably state the negation of those statements, that children prefer McDonald's to Burger King. Right. Similarly for ethics, but there's another type where it would be like, well, both parties in a voluntary exchange profit from the exchange. You can't really properly state the negative of that. It makes no sense to state the negative of that one party doesn't profit. And similarly for here ethics, it doesn't make sense to say I ought not argue right now.
Okay, so would you agree that the statement that the law of non-contradiction need not apply to the statement the grass ought to be green?
Well, the law of non-contradiction definitely applies to it. It's just not really relevant there. It's because you could state its negation perfectly well. It's that the negation of it isn't an inherent contradiction.
What do you mean it applies there?
Well, I mean, it applies to any given statement. You would have to check off that it doesn't violate the law of non-contradiction, and, it doesn't, right?
Well, I mean, I think there could be domains in which the law of non-contradiction need not necessarily apply.
I think this might be maybe a semantic dispute over what we mean by apply, because I would still say that, well, you're still making a logical statement, so all of logic still applies to it. It's just you aren't actually needing to consider it because the negation is perfectly well formed.
So let me find a quote from you here. No, not that one. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the quote. Okay, well, I mean, I guess I could go to the next point because I can't find the quote right now. So, right, so you say it's a semantic point here that's being disputed. But I think I've seen you say something. Right, now I remember the quote. It was about abdication, complete abdication of truth. So I'll just Control F that. Right, now I found the quote. Right, so first, if it is, I am quoting you, by the way, right now. First, if it is true that the conclusions reached in an argumentation only matter during the course of that argumentation, the same could be said of all conclusions, not only those related to the argument from argument. It's as if I were to grant that it is true that voluntary trades are mutually beneficial, but only when we are actually arguing that, and that after the argument I revert back to believing in the contrary, that they are not mutually beneficial. This would be a complete abdication of truth, right? So to me, it seems to me like you are kind of marrying different domains of truth. You are marrying the normative domain and you are marrying the descriptive domain. But my message essentially here would be that truth does not need to apply in all possible domains for it to apply in any. So I could, for example, in my opinion, be completely consistent as a moral nihilist and to say that truth does not apply in the domain of normative statements, but the truth does apply at least sometimes in the domain of descriptive statements.
But I mean, the proof is of the same sort. In both domains, it's basically negative demonstration. You're saying, well, the negation of this statement doesn't make any sense, so therefore it has to be true.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
It's well, the proof is of the same structure. You're saying, well, the negation doesn't make any sense, so it has to be that the negation of the negation, i.e. the original statement, is true.
Right, but I would again go back to the grass ought to be green or the grass ought not to be green, right? I mean, to me, that statement would not need to be necessarily true.
Well, I don't know that you could apply truth to such a statement of the grass ought to be green or the grass ought not to be green.
Exactly, it would not be truth apt. So there would be this domain in which the law of non-contradiction would not apply.
Well, the law of non-contradiction still applies in normativity in general, because there are certain norms which you couldn't propose.
Right, and that's where I would disagree with you. I would say that in normativity there actually is no place where the law of non-contradiction applies, that it's all non-truth apt. That's essentially the position of moral nihilism in metaethics.
But what about the statement, I ought not ever argue?
I ought not ever argue. Well, I don't. Are you asking if that's a performative contradiction?
Yeah, could I state that without contradicting myself?
Let's say I ought not ever speak because we are not sure, or at least I am not completely sure of what like arguing means. So I ought not ever speak. That would not be a performative contradiction because my performance of speaking does not contradict the proposition I ought never to speak.
Well, it contradicts in that you have to presuppose, if you are speaking, that you ought to speak. You are saying, hey, I ought to be doing this thing, or else you wouldn't be doing it.
Right. So in this subjective domain, right, it's not actually... Okay, this is a good example. I could truly, very strongly believe that my favorite hockey team ought to win the championship, right? And yet, I would at the same time, I could recognize that this statement is not objectively verifiable, whether my favorite hockey team ought to win the championship or whether my favorite hockey team ought not to win the championship.
Right, but again, that's of the different type. That's of the type where you can state the negation of it.
I do not make that distinction between like different kinds of normative statements as a moral nihilist. To me, all normative statements, they just fall under this category of non-truth apt.
But I mean, why don't you make that distinction? Because it's very clear that they are of a different type. These different types of normative statements, because of one type you can't state the negation.
Because I can't objectively confirm any normative statements as far as I know.
But you can, though, because of the latter type, you can't state the negation of any of them without contradicting yourself.
It's a subjective confirmation if I believe a statement, right? It's not an objective verification if I believe that I ought to speak, for example. That's not objectively verified, right? It's not because I believe that I ought to speak that therefore it is true that I ought to speak.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying you couldn't state I ought not ever speak without contradicting yourself. Like, do you think when I speak that I have to believe that I ought to speak?
When you speak, do you have to believe that?
I mean, let's just take this into like.
I mean, I know. I mean, I think you could like speak in your sleep, for example.
Well, that's not an action though. I'm talking about like the action of speech. Like we can take this into the praxeology sense of the word. Like, you know, I think that my speaking will raise myself on my value scale, so I think that I ought to do that. Or else I wouldn't do it.
Well, I mean, ultimately, I would get really autistic at this point, and I would like bring up like determinism.
So you'd bring up determinism. Did you say stuff after that? Because you cut off a little bit at the end. You still there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, excellent. Right, so I would bring up determinism here, and I become really autistic and say that there's not really. Oh fuck! I forgot the line of thought after that. Cut off. Can you repeat what you said before that?
So we're taking it into the praxeology where I'm saying, well, I expect that speaking will attain more utility for me than not speaking. I think it'll raise me on my scale of values, so I think that I ought to do that, so I think that I ought to speak.
Right, so ultimately I would bring up determinism and say that if you go back far enough, like you look at your life, you go back far enough, you realize that the preferences that you have, you go all the way back to when you were birthed, and you realize that the preferences that you have, you did not actually prefer to have those preferences. And if determinism is indeed true, then there just would not be such things as voluntary preferences at all, but rather, preferences would just create new preferences and new preferences that it would follow like the laws of physics and go on until we reach this point where we are here right now. And nothing would truly in that sense be voluntary.
Could I maybe do a steelman to see if I understand your point there? So,
right.
Are you saying that, I couldn't have preferred something else? I would have always had that preference.
Yeah, I think you're getting it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think you could have chosen differently, but I don't think that negates the fact that you expected that you'd always have expected that choosing A over B it would bring you more joy, more well-being, but that doesn't mean that you didn't choose A over B.
Yes, you did choose it. I don't dispute that.
Yeah. So
where does this get us?
If you chose it, then you had to have believed that you ought to choose that.
Okay, that's fine, but I mean, my point from earlier still stands, which is that just because you believe it, it doesn't mean that it's actually true, that it's actually objectively true. Because again, the hockey team example, my favorite hockey team ought to win the championship. I truly, strongly believe this, but yet I recognize that it's not objectively verifiable. It's just a subjective belief.
But so then we do have that when you are speaking, when you're acting in any way, you believe that you ought to act in that way, right?
You ought to act, assuming you are doing it voluntarily. But I mean, I'm again, that's where the determinism example comes in, and I'm not sure if it is voluntary.
But I mean, we agreed that when you choose A over B, you had to have believed that you ought to choose A over B. So long as, you're not being coerced by someone, right?
I
mean, if you're being coerced, I don't think you are choosing, actually. So no, I think that applies across the board. If you choose A over B, then you had to believe that you ought to choose A over B.
If you choose A over B, then you have to, right? But choosing, what is choosing?
Well, it's you have a set of different options available to you, and you are picking one and rejecting all the others.
Right. So essentially, we kind of have behavior where if you see chocolate ice cream, you see vanilla ice cream, you're gonna pick chocolate behavior. We're gonna say that your behavior is such that you're gonna pick chocolate ice cream. Is this what we're saying?
Moreover, that when you choose either chocolate or vanilla, you're choosing to forego the other one, assuming you can only eat one bit of ice cream at a time, right?
Yes, you will be foregoing it, yeah.
Yeah, so you have chosen chocolate instead of vanilla. So you've chosen to go for chocolate.
Okay, we can go with this.
Right, so that means that you had to believe that you ought to choose chocolate instead of vanilla.
All right.
And similarly, if I am speaking, I'm choosing to speak rather than not speak. So I ought to believe that I should choose speaking instead of not speaking.
I think you smuggled an ought in there, because what do you mean you ought to believe that?
I'm sorry, I would have to believe that. I must believe that I ought to choose speaking instead of not speaking.
Okay, that's fine.
So therefore, speech presupposes that you ought to be speaking.
Speech presupposes that you ought to be speaking. No, that's where the is ought violation occurs. It's not because you believe that you ought to be speaking that it is actually true that you ought to be speaking, because you could just be wrong. I mean, just consider a serial killer. A serial killer believes that they ought to be serial killing, but that doesn't, right? You would say that's not true.
But I'm just getting up the structure of the argument from argument. I when I'm not speaking, I have chosen to not speak, right? In that little gap there, I am choosing that I must believe that I ought not speak during that gap. That I'm just saying, whenever you are acting in a way, when you are choosing A over B, you have to believe that you ought to choose A over B.
As long as we are purely in the descriptive realm and we are saying that you will choose, you will believe that you ought to do that. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So, do we agree that speech presupposes, i.e., when I'm speaking, I'm presupposing that I ought to speak?
You are presupposing that you ought to speak. Well, you could just be speaking kind of subconsciously.
Yeah, so it's applying only in action. So, like, if I'm asleep and my vocal cords are just going off on their own, then that's not really
no, but
speech as an action.
Do you know how people in the real world, how they talk, right? I mean, have you ever heard somebody say, I don't know why I said that? So they kind of like, they just speak like without thinking about it first.
Okay, see, so this is praxeology is applying only to purposeful behaviors, i.e., those ones where you are engaged in this choice, not where you're just kind of daydreaming.
You have contemplated. You have contemplated them before.
Rather than just simply subconscious. Like, if I hit my knee right now, my leg would fly off. I'll actually make, because I am doing the hitting. If I was just like, minding my own business, somebody came along and hit my knee, then my leg would go off. It would like kick, but I didn't choose to kick rather than not kick. So that would be purposeless behavior, i.e., not an action. So we're talking about speech as an action here. I'll just say it this way: if I choose to speak, then I'm presupposing that I ought to speak.
I think we got that far.
Okay, so therefore, could I ever, in speech as an action, could I ever propose that I ought not speak?
Without a performative contradiction?
Yeah, without a contradiction.
Yes, you could. It would not be a contradiction, because they ought, right? It could actually be true that you ought not to. For example, moral realism could be true. And moral realism says you ought not to speak, and you speak, you ought not to speak. Right?
But I don't think either of us think moral realism is true, though.
Right, but it's just an example.
It's an example of a world which isn't ours, though.
All right, so moral nihilism could be true.
But again, like, you can't just, say, well, what if something which isn't true is true? We have to get there. We have to determine whether or not your version of morality is true or my version of morality is true.
Well, to be clear, I don't think I have a version of morality. honest. At least not by like your terms, because I think you're using like morality in a much more strict sense than I would use it. Because I mean, I've heard you like define ethics around like the universality that you would need to like prescribe them onto like everybody, basically.
Yes, and that is derivable from the argument from argument. So let's just say in super precise terms, could I ever legitimately say, i.e., as like an actual thing to be taken serious, like that I'm giving this as a serious claim that I ought not to be speaking right now?
Yes, because the is-ought distinction obtains.
But
The is-ought distinction. Hold on, there is no performance. There is no performance that is contradicting the proposition that you ought not be speaking.
the performance is in speaking. So I am.
No, but
so
hold on. You are speaking. You are speaking. You are
Yes.
not oughting to speak. You are speaking. You are not oughting to speak.
But as we went over, if I am choosing to speak instead of not speak, I must believe that I ought to speak.
Exactly, and your beliefs are merely subjective. The objective truth could be that you ought not to speak, even though you are speaking.
Okay, could I say, I believe that I ought not speak?
Let me process that. I believe that I ought not speak. Well, I mean, I guess you could be like, I mean, assuming that you indeed do believe that you ought to speak when you are speaking, I think you could be mistaken. For example, I think you could believe that mistakenly. For example.
But I'd be wrong, right? Because I would be simultaneously presupposing that I believe that I ought to speak, and that that contradicts with me saying that I ought not speak. There's a contradiction there.
Okay. I mean, we can move with that.
So that would be a performative contradiction to try and say that, right?
I believe I ought not to speak. Because, hold on, I'm still trying to process this, so... Right, if we assume that when you are speaking, you are actually...
but I don't think it's an assumption.
You are actually believe... Well, I mean, I'm just saying it for the... you don't need to cling to that, right? So... Right, when you are... If we assume that when you are speaking... Can you repeat that again?
So I'm saying that when I try to say something in an argument, like, actually making this as a proposal, I currently believe that I ought not be engaging in this speech right now. That would be a contradiction, right?
I believe that I ought... no, because your belief could be in a different domain than, your... Right, so you could, when you're acting, you could believe in the domain of subjectivity that you ought to speak. But in your heart of hearts, you could believe that it's actually true that you ought not to speak. Right.
I feel like you're muddying the waters here with like different types of oughts. I think there's only one type of ought. What the actor is believing.
Right. I mean, this is the point. This is the point that the moral realism could be true, and it's a very serious question in philosophy whether moral realism is true, right? So it's not something to be thrown out.
But I think they're wrong, and they don't have a proper justification for that. I'm saying.
I think they are wrong too, but I mean, this is a big question.
Right, but then why are you using their arguments?
Because I care about truth. I care about the objective truth.
So your only attack against the argument from argument, as it stands, is to first presuppose something you don't even think is correct.
Well, it's called the devil's advocate argument, and you know, moral realism could be true. I mean, I don't know for certain that moral realism is not true. So yeah, I mean, like the point is you don't get to a deductive conclusion from these kinds of premises.
But we do, unless we assume something which we both agree isn't correct. Right? If we were
No,
to
I mean, we shouldn't assume.
if we were
assume that moral realism is not correct.
if we go ahead and say, well, let's first of all say that what if the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold? Well, then all of this falls to bits. That's not a legitimate argument.
Well, I mean, the law of non-contradiction, it does not hold everywhere. For example, there's para-consistent logic in which there are actually three truth values. One truth value is true, second truth value is false, and the third truth value is true and false. So it does not apply the law of the excluded middle, and it adds this true contradiction value into it. And this is a real system that you could implement into your mind, and I don't see a problem with it.
I mean, it's not logic, right?
It is logic.
So it's logic, but it doesn't have the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah, it's not classical logic. It's paraconsistent logic.
Right, and in what sense is it true if it allows for the law of non-contradiction? Like, how does it actually map onto metaphysical reality?
Well, I don't see why the classical logic would be true either, in that sense.
I mean, how not? I mean, we're using classical logic right now.
For example, I am a moral nihilist, so I would actually apply like the paraconsistent logic when I would talk about normative statements. So I would say that if we think about it as a Venn diagram, so we have the true circle and we have the false circle, and somewhere in the middle there's overlap between the true and the false circle. So I would put normative statements inside that overlap. Where like the normative statements, they are both true and they are false, so they are kind of like true contradictions in a sense. Whereas like descriptive statements, at least most of them, I would put exclusively in the true circle or exclusively in the false circle.
So is it true that they are exclusively in one of these circles?
Yeah.
Could they be in all three circles at once? I.e., could they be
no, they could not.
But what about the intersection? Is that not in both different?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So there are three truth values: true, false, and then the third truth value is true and false. That's the true contradiction value.
I mean, so it seems like the only real attacks against argumentation ethics, then I've had this from Present Sunday too, is to just completely reject logic and say, well, actually, we've got this different type of logic. And under this type of logic, it doesn't hold.
I mean, I don't know why you would be so confident in the classical logic, being the one true universal logic.
I mean, where did you get this like cookie triple logic from?
There's this guy called Graham Priest.
So where did he get it from? Like, what makes this like the proper way to go about logic?
The claim here is not that it's a proper way to go about it. The claim is more so that it's a system that you could implement for certain means. Just like the classical logic is a system that we could implement for many means. And granted, like classical logic is very useful for many purposes. But I mean, let's not forget that the reason we even have developed like the classical logic is because we have evolved. We are subject to the theory of evolution, and we have just found use in those kinds of truths that happen to correlate very much with classical logic, because those kinds of truths, right, when we have like kind of created this framework of classical logic in our mind, it has allowed our ancestors to survive and reproduce.
So how exactly we determine what the correct system of logic is to implement?
My claim is not that there is a correct system of logic. There are just different systems of logic that you can implement.
So just come up with any arbitrary system of logic and it doesn't matter.
Well, they don't have to be arbitrary. Right? I mean, paraconsistent logic is not arbitrary. classical logic is not arbitrary.
What makes para-consistent logic non-arbitrary?
What makes classical logic non-arbitrary? I'm just curious what your standard here is.
I mean, it's the basis for truth. In trying to dispute that this is the correct system, you'd have to implement it. You'd have to speak logically.
Well, I mean, I can of course use the system. It doesn't mean that I have to accept it in all circumstances at all times.
But how are you personally determining when to use any given system of logic?
I mean, personally, I would just determine it based on what suits my desires.
So it's just personal preference on when you want to use proper logic and when you want to use any sort of random system of logic some guy came up with.
Well, I reject the phrasing of proper logic, but yes.
Right, so how on earth is this at all going to be grounded in reality?
Look, hold on, you said the random guy came up with... I mean, a random guy came up with classical logic as well.
I disagree. I think a random guy found classical logic.
All right, well, I mean, that's going to be a disagreement that might be unresolvable.
So, I mean, it very much seems like the case where the only, I suppose we could say, strong critiques of argumentation ethics come in when we just completely say, well, actually, I'm not applying the same logic as you. It's like, you know, what logic are we currently engaged in this argument?
Well, I am personally using... I would say I'm using classical logic.
Okay, so we're using classical logic in argumentation, then.
At least in this argumentation. We could have different argumentations. Maybe we would use paraconsistent logic. Maybe we would use fuzzy logic. Maybe we would use whatever logic there is, you know?
Okay. So, right. So, at least in this argument, can we go ahead with, well, you couldn't propose a contradiction?
Sure, I'm fine with that. Hold on, you couldn't propose... that's actually... I retreat that because I'm not sure what you mean here. So, contradiction in the normative domain... I will not agree to not propose a contradiction in the normative domain, because to me the law
just sounds entirely arbitrary then.
In the normative domain.
You just arbitrarily sliced out normative statements
well, it's
from
not arbitrary.
The domain of logic.
Look, if we are looking at grass and I say the grass is green, I'm gonna say that is objectively verifiable because the grass either has to be green or the grass has to not to be green. But if we're looking at the same grass and we say that the grass ought to be green, I'm not gonna say that the law of non-contradiction applies here because I'm not sure that either grass ought to be green or grass ought not to be green.
But what about a statement like, I ought not be arguing right now? That's of a different type from grass ought to be green versus grass ought not to be green. It's clearly of a different type.
I ought not be arguing. Sorry, what was that? Can you repeat it?
Like, what if I right now said, I ought not be arguing right now?
That's not going to be a performative contradiction, as I said, because the only way you arrive at the performative contradiction is to violate Hume's guillotine.
No. I don't think it violates Hume's guillotine. I think it sidesteps it. You stay entirely within saying, you're basically saying, right, these ethics are not possible to propose. Therefore, that you couldn't propose them without contradiction. You know, you can't propose them. So the alternative has to be the case. It has to be presupposed by everybody.
You can propose them without a contradiction. It's not a contradiction to say I ought not speak, because the performance, remember, the performance here is me actually speaking, whereas the proposition says something about ought, what I ought to do. It could both be true that I ought not to speak and that I am speaking. That's not contradictory at all.
But it has to be. I mean, I think oughts are held subjectively, though. Like a murderer thinks that he ought.
That's excellent.
A murderer thinks that he ought to be murdering, right? But he couldn't defend this action. He couldn't defend that he ought to be murdering, because he couldn't propose it.
I don't see why he couldn't propose it.
If he tried to propose that he ought to be going around murdering, he would contradict himself in that he would be having to say, "Hey, here are some reasons why let's have a nice peaceful way to resolve this dispute over whether I should murder you." Oh, wait a minute, I am not looking for peaceful dispute resolution, am I? So he's contradicting himself.
Would he be arguing? Would he be arguing?
If he tried to argue, if he tried to argumentatively justify that he ought to be murdering, he would contradict himself.
Right, but I think this is gonna get us to another critique, which is that the definition of argumentation I find to be too strict in argumentation ethics.
What is too strict about it?
Right. So here's the first example. Argumentation. I'm right. This is kind of a semi-quote, not a perfect quote, but you often say like argumentation is not just free-floating propositions disconnected from a proposer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this would actually be a norm I reject, because I recognize that propositions can be true even when the proposer does not believe the proposition themselves. Right? In fact, sometimes a devil's advocate argument might offer useful insights and might even turn out to be correct.
But I mean, that there still isn't a connected proposer there, right? It's still not a free-floating proposition. It's still connected to a proposer who's making this proposition.
Why does it matter?
Well, because you said the definition of argumentation is too strict because you take up umbrage with my assertion that argumentation is not just free-floating propositions, that it has to be connected to a proposer. But then you've given me an example of a devil's advocate, but that still has a connected proposer. It's still not free-floating propositions.
Hold on. Not. What do you mean? I want to ask you, what do you mean when you say argumentation is not just free-floating propositions disconnected from a proposer or something like that?
It's getting at the fact that it's a human action. It requires the use of scarce means towards some end, right? It's not just, we're not just these wraiths who are not concerned with scarcity at all.
Well, I mean, I don't see how that matters at all. I mean, it seems to me like
it matters in terms of the homestead ethic. That's how you get at the homestead ethic. Basically, it's laying the foundation for that. It's saying, well, we have to concern ourselves when we're engaged in argumentation. We have to concern ourselves with scarcity, and when you engage in argumentation, because it's a human action, you are homesteading scarce means to do that argumentation. So we have a homestead ethic.
So recall back to the murderer who says that they ought to be murdering.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that the definition of argumentation that you are giving, it's basically right. It's there to define argumentation specifically in such a way that it justifies libertarian norms. But it would seem to me that I would just say to this definition, when you define it so strictly, that so what if I'm not arguing? Like, I mean, it's just not arguing what I'm doing. Instead, what I'm doing, it's, let's call it garguing. And garguing just means what people typically mean by arguing, but not what it means in argumentation ethics.
In argumentation ethics, it is what people typically mean, because to dispute this, you'd have to say, I'm garguing, so I actually don't care about getting at the truth. Which is like, well, I mean, why are we listening to you then?
Oh, let's talk about getting to the truth, because, okay. I'm gonna find the quote here. Okay. So, in your lecture on argumentation ethics, you say, what would it mean to say that argumentation need not be peaceful? Well, it would mean that you don't care about the truth because you would be choosing to violently attack your opponent to solve the dispute rather than allowing them to present counter arguments. Therefore, violence must not be a valid move in an argumentation. So to this, I would offer a counter example. And it would be a rhetorician that is so excellent at peddling falsehoods that if you allow them to argue, they will actually convince a whole bunch of people of falsehoods. But instead, if you beat this person up, they will not be able to do this, right? So you ask me if I value truth. Well, I mean, I would say I value truth in some contexts. I don't value truth in other contexts. For example, in this context, I would not beat up the rhetorician. I would not care that much if they like peddle falsehoods and end up succeeding at it, right? I mean, yeah.
The question is, how do you know that they are falsehoods without first engaging in argument over the subject? Right? It's the Socratic notion, I know that I don't know.
I mean, let's be honest. I mean, most of the time when I've like come to like some realizations that I find insightful, it has not been in argumentation. Rather, it has been when I have myself contemplated thoughts on my own.
Well, that would certainly be a form of seeking truth, but argumentation is also a form of seeking truth.
Why does that matter?
Because it's still a specific form of seeking truth. So if you are engaged in an argument with someone, if you have this dialectic going, it's not a valid move to say, well, finntronaut, right now we have this disagreement, and if you don't agree with me, I'm going to beat you until you say that you agree with me. Well, I don't actually care about what truth you might bring to the matter. I just care about getting you to say that you agree with me.
Okay, now I'm getting to another. Right, I'm actually recalling something else that I had a critique on, which is that let me find it. Right, it is that the definition of argumentation is unspecified, right? So I have a question here. Can one put a hierarchy on the qualifications for arguing? For example, truth comes first, agreement comes second, peaceful means come third.
I don't see why such a hierarchy would be required or implied at all.
Okay, so like if the answer is no, that you can't put that hierarchy.
Well, I just don't see why one is required or implied.
Yes, I'm explaining.
I don't
I'm
see
explaining
that, right?
Yeah, I'm explaining that. So, right, I find that if you can't put the hierarchy there, then there are going to be contradictory norms in argumentation or norms of argumentation according to what you have written in your article. So example would be the desire for agreement getting both parties further away from the truth than where they started. For example, maybe they're just too eager to find agreement that they just end up like post hoc rationalizing their beliefs and finding some compromise that actually gets them further from the truth. Another example might be peaceful means getting in the way of attaining agreement. So, for example, sometimes it might be better way at getting to agreement by beating somebody up than by actually, arguing with them, by having discussions with them.
Well, I don't think you're specifically trying to get at agreement over what the truth is. So you're trying to get to the truth of the matter still, right? It's all about truth seeking. And in this truth seeking, we have that, well, it's got to be conflict free. And, we've got to be getting at the truth.
Yeah, but these values, for example, truth, agreement, peaceful means, these can come to conflict at some times. And I'm not even, by the way, I'm not even talking about argumentation here. I'm just talking about the norms that argumentation implies according to argumentation.
The argumentation is a specific form of truth seeking where you are engaging in this seeking of truth through peaceful means in a dialectical exchange. And that is the core of it. And this implies that, well, we've got to not have violence because it's conflict free, right?
Maybe, but Right. Why ought anybody argue?
Because they want to get at the truth, I suppose.
Well, you can get to truth, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
You can get to truth by just contemplating about things. So you
Then
don't actually have to-
contemplate. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, my point here is essentially that right now, by the definition of argumentation ethics, I would refuse to say that I am arguing right here.
And in what way are you not arguing?
I am not arguing because I have not accepted all of the presuppositions put in argumentation ethics for arguing.
What presupposition
example-
haven't you accepted?
For example, the presupposition of agreement. For example,
Well,
I am not here. Sorry, I am not here to argue just for us to like attain.
I think you might.
agreement.
I think
Like,
you might have
perfectly. I mean, honestly,
misunderstood.
I'm perfectly fine.
I think you
I'm
may have
perfectly
misunderstood.
fine.
I don't
Okay.
think agreement is a necessary presupposition. Like I want you to. In what sense do you think I am saying that agreement is a presupposition? It might be the case that we don't agree.
You said something in your lecture. You said argumentation. Both parties need to be. Argumentation is something that you do in order to arrive at the mutually agreed upon, arrive at the synthesis. I think those are your words.
So you're seeking to do that. That's not a presupposition.
Yes,
so you're seeking to get at that, but you are not presupposing that you must agree.
I'm not though.
I
mean,
right.
I don't have a.
So you're not seeking right. So you're not seeking to get to agreement over what the truth is.
What the truth is, the truth. What specific truth are you referring to here?
The truth of, I suppose, the argumentation ethics, right? Are you not seeking to get to like the truth of that, and to get to this synthesis?
Well, that's the thing. I am seeking the truth, but I don't think the goal of synthesis is actually like compatible with this, because we could just have like totally different beliefs that might be incompatible to where we just can't resolve our disputes. Right? So that's why I find it important to actually not have the goal of synthesis in agreement, because it might lead you to false beliefs.
So maybe I've not specified the argumentation ethics position well enough in that lecture. I don't think you are presupposing that agreement is anyway the highest value. I think you're presupposing things like, well, it's got to be a conflict-free way of resolving the dispute. You've got to be trying to get at the truth, which implies the conflict-free thing, in fact, right?
Sorry, I am doing what?
You've got to be presupposing, do you reject that you've got to be presupposing that you're getting at the truth, that you want to get at the truth of the matter in argumentation?
It depends on what definition of argumentation we are using. If you're talking about the argumentation ethics argumentation, which I refuse to participate
well,
in
your type of argumentation, in finntronaut's argumentation, do you disagree that you are trying to get at truth? Do you reject that presupposition?
In argumentation, not necessarily. Sometimes for example, I would allow argumentation even about as a joke. For example, I've done joke debates where we have argued about positions we don't necessarily even believe in. And I would allow that as argumentation, but I mean, argumentation ethics obviously would not allow that as argumentation.
Is that a devil's advocate thing? I.e., you're, actually... Because if it's a devil's advocate, then you are trying to get at the truth, or are you literally just doing it for fun? Like, well, I'm a commie because stinky poo-poo shit brains, right? Are you saying stuff like that? Or are you saying, well, I'm a communist because the workers, it's more efficient if they own the means of production, and the economic calculation problem is flawed, or something like that?
There is some truth. If you want to do a good job at this kind of joke debate, there is gonna be some truth in it, but the truth is not gonna be the be all end all of it. And I'd say even like in debates like this, like, I mean, is the truth truly the be all end all? Well, I'd
Well, it
say
is for me.
there are other concerns, like maybe you want to perform for the audience. I know what you have said, for example, about that in your lecture, but that's a real concern. Like, you don't have to put 100% on truth,
But
in my opinion, in order to
I'm trying to get
participate in
at the
argumentation.
truth here. Are you trying to get at the truth here?
To an extent, at least.
Right. So we have it that you're trying to get at the truth. So it wouldn't be a valid
To an
move.
extent. To an extent, though.
But so then would it suddenly become a valid move if the extent is 0 that you're trying to get at the truth to, beat me and get me to agree?
Sorry, I did not quite understand that.
So if we're trying to get at the truth of the matter, I don't know what it means to be getting at the truth to an extent. You either are trying to get at the truth or you're not. Right?
Right.
So would
there
it be
could
a valid move
like
for you to
different
beat me
goals.
to get me to
Hold on.
agree?
Right. If I wanted to get to the goal of truth at the best possible rate I could, then I would actually not be doing exactly what I'm doing here, because here I'm trying to, like, I'm trying to respond to what you are saying, and that is actually going to kind of like take something out of the truth-seeking activity, because this would be a really boring stream if when you said something, I would like sit here for 10 minutes without saying anything, and then I would give you a response. That would be the typing, right? If you want to really have a truth-seeking discussion, we can do that on Discord in DMs, or we can even publish those DMs if you want to, right? But I mean, here there's gonna be like conflicting interests that are not gonna allow for a perfect attainment of trying to get the truth.
So it's not about maximization of truth seeking, because I don't think you can really measure such a deal, right? I'm just talking about, I don't think you could before it happens say I don't think you can weight different truth seeking activities other than just entrepreneurial. You have to guess, right? So you have to be trying to get at the truth in argumentation, surely, right?
Not necessarily.
So I mean, right, we could call this good faith argumentation, where you are trying to get at the truth, though.
To an extent. If to an extent is enough, then sure.
Right, so therefore it wouldn't be a valid move to beat your opponent until they agreed with you, because then you're not trying to get at the truth, right?
Right, but the point is that it's not actually the truth value there. When you would beat up your opponent, well, I mean, you could make them believe truly something if you beat them up, right? I mean, who says you couldn't?
Right, but you're not trying to get at the truth there. You're just trying to get them to accede to your position.
Right, but the truth could be like not the most important value here. It could be, for example, agreement first, peaceful means second, and then truth third.
But if you're not trying to get at the truth, then you're not genuinely engaged in a dialectic, are you?
No, but you would be trying to get.
So yeah,
to the
no.
truth. It would just not be the highest value here.
But you're not trying to get at the truth because your opponent might know something that you don't know.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you can arrive at truths through different means. For example, right? Right. I mean, it doesn't always have to be that truth that your opponent knows that you need to discover. It could be some other kind of truth that you discover through other kinds of information leaks that occur. For example, when you beat the person up and,
But I don't think...
Realize, right, maybe you realize that when you beat the person up, you can make them agree with whatever you want. Right?
But that's...
So that could be a truth that you discover.
But you're not getting at the truth, like... In argumentation there, you're getting at the empirical case of, well, what happens if I beat people there? You're not engaged in argumentation, you're engaged in some sort of, inquiry, biological inquiry or psychological inquiry as to what happens when you beat people, right? You're not engaged in argumentation with that person, you're engaged in beating that person.
Well, I mean, I would say that there's something about because like the attempt in argumentation ethics is really to take the norms of argumentation and to like transfer them to the ethics of libertarianism. But the values there within, and this is what I'm essentially saying, is that the values there within could have a different importance to them, right? And thus, it could arrive you at like very non-libertarian norms if you took like just the norms of argumentation and you applied them to libertarianism. Then you could arrive at some kind of norm, like, for example, where you're gonna use aggression to find truth, for example. That could be an example. So
but that wouldn't be an argumentative way to get at the truth. You're not engaged in argumentation. Like I might be trying to get at the truth of, well, what happens when I stab people without their consent, and I go, oh, he didn't like that very much, I'm getting at that truth through different means, but I'm not able to justify that, because to justify I have to engage in argumentation, which is a specific form of getting at the truth. Hold on, can I just go to the toilet before you respond?
All right. Yeah.
All right. Boop. BRB. All right, I'm back. So I think I was saying that.
Right. So
all right, sorry, where are you?
Right. So the point is that these are the norms of argumentation, whether you can do them in argumentation or not. These are the norms of argumentation. At least some of them. They're trying to get the truth, trying to get that agreement, trying to do it through peaceful means. These are the norms of argumentation, and if you were to allow, right, not saying that you have allowed, but if you were to allow these norms to be hierarchized in such a way that where one value can be higher than another, then the same could of course be done in libertarian norms, where you, for example, you put agreement first, truth second, peaceful means third, and so on. And these would like allow you to like violate the other norms when the other norm, right, is coming to conflict with the other norm.
I think I see sort of the disagreement here. So I don't think it is that you are putting these normative presuppositions on a hierarchy. I think it's more like a set of criteria. So you're checking off, right, they're trying to get at the truth, and they're engaged in an exchange of propositions, yada, yada, yada. Therefore, it's an argumentation that this person is engaged in, rather than they're trying to get at the truth, but they're not engaged in a dialectical exchange. So it's not argumentation. So they might be getting at the truth of what happens when you murder people, right?
Argumentation ethics says that the norms of argumentation are the libertarian norms. Does it say that?
It says that the normative presuppositions of argumentation imply libertarianism.
Does it imply all the libertarian norms?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so yeah, I mean, my point is
i.e.
really
from
right.
argumentation ethics, you have NAP, and from the NAP, and you have libertarianism.
Okay, I mean, I think this critique is about exhausted now. I can move to something else. So, I mean, this sounds like a great segue to this critique, which is that it's actually not clear which sect of libertarianism argumentation ethics would imply, if any. So there are sects of libertarianism that are incompatible with each other. For example, most libertarians would adhere to the traditionalist nap that only bars initiations of violence against people or their property. But you could be a less traditionalist libertarian and adhere to a nap that bars initiations of violence against humans and animals. These two naps are incompatible with each other. For example, from the standpoint of the animal rights nap, it would not be an aggression to punish somebody who initiates violence against animals, but from the perspective of the traditionalist nap, that would be an aggression. The norms of argumentation do not specify which nap is to be followed.
Well, I don't think these are two separate NEPs. There is only the NEP, which is saying do not initiate conflict. Now, what exactly is initiating conflict? That is where the rest of the corpus of libertarian theory arises from. Well, we have it that, a conflict has to be with another actor. So it has to be with another actor, right? And the traditionalists would say, well, it's only humans who act. And the, animal rightsers would think that, well, animals also act. If they didn't think animals acted, then the NEP wouldn't apply to them.
I think you seem to agree with this critique, so, I mean, I can move over from there.
Yeah. So it would be... I'll just summarize. It'll be an empirical question of who exactly libertarianism applies to, but it's still only one libertarianism.
Yes. All right. I think we agree there. I've went over moral realism could be true. Okay, this is a good one. So there's a leap from pacifistic argumentation to non-aggressive argumentation. So if we accept that there can be no violence in argumentation, then neither will there be self-defense in argumentation. Thus, the norms of argumentation would say nothing about whether it's justified to defend yourself. And if you wanted to do this is-ought violation of what the norms of argumentation say to what you ought to do in argumentation, you would arrive at pacifism being the standard norm of argumentation rather than non-aggressionism.
Well, no, so peaceful as it pertains to argumentation ethics is saying, well, you're having this dispute and you're choosing to resolve it peacefully. So it's saying, right, peaceful ways of resolving disputes are better than violent ways. It's not saying that, therefore, you could never do any sort of violence. It's saying you can't violently resolve disputes. You cannot initiate these conflicts. And then you have, estoppel, which is coming and saying, well, if somebody has aggressed in some way, then they cannot, what's the word, justify that you should not retribute against them, right? It's that's how you get to punishment theory. But in just simple self-defense, if you own your body, it's obviously the case that you are allowed to defend your body, right? Or else you don't own it. You're not allowed to exclude people from it, so you don't own it, right?
Well, no, I don't agree with that, but okay. I don't agree that you own your body. I mean, I would just say that you possess your body, and that's it.
Well, at least in argumentation ethics terms, you do own your body. You have to own your body, right? So you're allowed to defend your body. It's not you who is the violent one there. It's the person who's coming in.
It's not clear to me that, I mean, it's
you.
actually not clear. It's actually not clear to me that argumentation ethics arrives at any conclusion of self-ownership.
Oh, it absolutely does. Because both parties in argumentation have to have exclusive control over their body, and you could not dispute this control. So, i.e., they'd be allowed to exclude you, so they have ownership.
All right. So, I'll just say that in my view, the pacifist could use argumentation ethics, and they could come there and say that the libertarian, the non-aggressionist, is actually violating argumentation ethics, because there just is no violence at all in argumentation, and it's a similar move as the libertarian does, where they like try to get from the fact of what is not in argumentation to like the non-aggression principle or whatever. Then there's gonna be and this is what I already alluded to earlier, which is that the conclusion of argumentation ethics, I don't find it to be normative. So the conclusion, as far as I'm concerned, only says that only libertarian norms can be argumentatively justified. But I mean, this to me seems like just a descriptive statement.
It is.
Like
it is
anybody.
Descriptive. But do you disagree that only libertarian ethics could be argumentatively justified?
Yes, I do disagree, because I think you could justify, for example, animal rights ethics, and you could justify pacifist ethics.
But how could you go about doing this?
How could you through argumentation ethics? Well, because the the norms of argumentation, they say nothing. They do not specify what the norms even are, right? I mean, it does not specify, are they libertarian norms? Are they the animal rights norms? Are they the pacifist
the argumentative norms, right? So it's the norms presupposing argumentation, right? I don't think those are pacifist norms, i.e. don't defend yourself ever, because you already presuppose that you own your body,
anything.
So you're allowed to defend yourself.
It doesn't say anything. It doesn't say anything about whether you are allowed to defend yourself or not.
It does.
It doesn't comment. It doesn't comment on that at all.
It does, because you could
the
not
norms
just
of argumentation do not.
You could not justify that you're not allowed to defend yourself, because I would say that you don't own yourself, i.e. you should not have exclusive control of yourself. That violates the presupposition that you should have exclusive control of yourself.
I'm not following this argument right now,
so,
to be honest with you.
So in argumentation, we presuppose that each party should have exclusive control over themselves, right? So you could not argue that any given party shouldn't have exclusive control over themselves, right?
Each party, in argumentation, each party should have exclusive control over themselves. So you could not argue. Can you repeat that?
So you couldn't argue that the other party shouldn't have exclusive control over themselves without contradiction.
You could, and again we get to the is odd problem that I have said a million times, which is that the odd, right? That's from the action you do not actually get that the odd is violated.
But you do, because right now I am presupposing that you ought to be able to have exclusive control of yourself, such that you are a separate party who can come up with his own conclusions on things. That is how we have a dialectical exchange.
To me, it seems that you are in a different country and we are talking over the internet, so you don't actually, right? I mean, you don't have a choice over that.
Well, I might have, like, you know, a laptop next to me which could launch like a CIA missile at your house, right? You don't know. Like, I could.
Yeah, you could. Okay.
I'm a Fed after all, right?
Okay. Here you have it.
Yeah.
Liquid Solo is a Fed.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, right, because I'm arguing with you, I'm presupposing that I shouldn't click the launch button and, you know, vaporize your house.
Well, I mean, you can say that. You can say that, but you know, if I had the same option, it would not necessarily have to be the same. That would not necessarily have to be reciprocated. For example, the reason for why I would not be nuking you could be something different. For example, maybe like maybe the people watching, or like I want to put this debate on my channel. So the people watching, they would see it and they would unsubscribe from my channel, and that could be the reasoning for why I'm not pushing the nuke button instead of, you know, the.
Okay, but it would also be presupposed by the fact that you're arguing with me. You might have other reasons why you might not want, for example, I wouldn't want to kill you because I think it would be really mean to kill you, right? I don't want to kill you, right? But I also think that I ought not do it because I'm currently engaged in this dialectical exchange, right? I might, if I was really mean, I might think I really want to kill that guy, but right now I'm trying to engage in a dialectical exchange with him, so I couldn't simultaneously engage in dialectical exchange with you and nuke you.
Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you're just talking about your own behavior.
Right, but that purposeful behavior has certain presuppositions to it. Specifically, this one has the presupposition that the other person ought to have exclusive control of themselves, or else they wouldn't be
no, well, I mean, I'm gonna make it clear. I'm not arguing here. I am garguing.
I mean, if it's not, I mean, which presupposition does garguing not have, right? Does it not have that the other person should have exclusive control over themselves?
Oh, it does not have that presupposition. For example, garguing would allow you to argue with your, I'm not gonna say debate with your prisoner.
Right, but then you're not actually trying to get to the truth, because then your prisoner is
no, that's right. Just not true. I mean,
right. Okay, but
well, I mean, I could argue with my prisoner, and we could hold argumentation tournaments, and we could be very serious about it, and we could really find some epic truths through these tournaments.
But then your prisoner, he's only allowed to say things which you have preordained for him.
No.
Otherwise, no, I mean, he has exclusive control of himself.
No, because no, he doesn't, because I'm keeping him in a cage
when
I'm arguing. He does not have exclusive control. I'm confining him.
But then you have a contradiction there, because you have to, if he is to come up with his own propositions, he has to have control over himself, right?
Well, he has to have some level of control, right? I mean, this is essentially the chop off the chop off the feet and don't cut off the tongue argument,
Right, but then we have it that, if you're chopping off his feet whilst he's arguing, you've violated the fact that it has to be conflict-free.
Yeah, and that's actually not something that garguing would even need, because I mean, you could be fighting at the same time, in such a way that it's actually aggressive, where one party started it. You could be fighting at the same time and also arguing about something. I know it's a silly example, but I mean, it's a serious objection.
Right, but then we don't have, we definitely wouldn't have argumentation ethics, but we do have argumentation ethics. When you're actually seriously trying to engage in this dialectical exchange, where you really want to get the truth out of this person, you really want to, have it that you have this change of propositions, then you have it that you cannot, engage in these horrible acts. We have libertarianism.
Well, I mean, there are the libertarian priors inserted into argumentation ethics, but I mean, I would just not accept it, right? I would just not accept that I am arguing, right? I would refuse the presuppositions there.
But then you're not actually, able to justify any of your actions, so we still have it that you cannot justify.
Not in the sense of argumentation defined through argumentation ethics, but I mean, I never said I care about justifying things through that framework.
But how can you justify them otherwise? You justify them through force of your violence rather than through force of argument?
I actually don't even need to justify anything, I believe. I can justify them to myself. I wouldn't even use the word justify. I would just say, because that implies kind of moral connotation.
Exactly. Because then you are basically just this guy going around doing things without caring about justifying them. But what we care about in ethics is people who actually care about justifying what they're doing.
Correct, and that's essentially,
that's argumentation ethics. You can't justify non-libertarian ethics.
Not through the definitions used for argumentation in argumentation ethics.
Right, you could go around, just slaughtering people. I don't disagree that you can do that.
Look, I think it's made very cheap through the how the libertarianism is loaded into the definition of argumentation. I think it's made very cheap for somebody to just say, you know what, I am not arguing. And here's actually another like pragmatic point, which is that I'm not sure this is actually a smart strategy for like a libertarian to employ, which is that where they are gonna say, "Oh, we're just not gonna argue with the status," because I mean, do we live in a libertarian society? No, we do not. So like the
No,
status
we
have
do.
the power, right? The status. Hold on, the status. We do live in a libertarian society.
No. I'm saying we do argue with the status, then we point out, well, buddy, you're contradicting yourself, so your point has to be wrong.
Hold on. No, but if the status tells you that they are not arguing, then neither can you be arguing with them, because there is the criteria in argumentation that there has to be two people who disagree on something.
Okay, yeah, if they just want to go around being statists without ever justifying what they're doing, then they're physically capable of doing that. Then they're not justifying anything that they're doing. That's the point.
Didn't let me get to the point yet.
Justify
right?
what you're doing if you're a statist.
Yeah, you didn't let me get to the point. So I find this pragmatically like dangerous for a libertarian, because we do not live in a libertarian society. We live in a very statist society, so where the statists have power. And I think it's very valuable to have this input of argumentation to the statists, where you can kind of like do the slave masters, where as slaves can like beg the slave masters to kind of give you some more freedom. Whereas if like the status became smart enough and they just said, we are not arguing with you, the libertarians, the argumentation ethics libertarians would just say, you know what, we're not arguing with you either, but that's a stupid move if you don't have the power.
Okay, but then they're going about not even pretending that what they're doing is ethical, because they know that they can't justify what they're doing on ethical grounds. They can't do it, and they agree on that. So then, like, I think that's a pretty fucking big win for libertarian ethics there. If all the other ethical schools thought, no, we can't actually deal with these guys, we can't actually dispute what they're saying on argumentative grounds, so we're just going to do them anyway. Like, that's a pretty fucking big defeat for them.
I mean, I find it funny that you are like so concerned about this ethics stuff, where like it's gonna be a win where you're gonna remain a slave, and much more of a slave than you would have if you would have like actually like argued with them.
It's a
you're
win.
Just gonna say it's a defeat because you have created this system of justification of ethics that you call argumentation ethics, in which you are justifying these things yourselves and the people who agree with you. I mean, it just seems to me like
it's a win on the grounds of logic. So people who care about logic in the audience will go like, well, I mean, these guys, they're right. These statists can't justify what they're doing. I don't want to be evil. I'm gonna side with these libertarians. That's a huge win. We win on the grounds of logic. We win on the grounds of pure argumentative rigor. We win the argument. Our arguments flow through, as they say.
Yeah, you win in your own mind, but how about if
we win in...
are just moral? How about if
we don't win in our own mind?
Hold on.
We win on the grounds of like the pure logic of the universe has made it such that we are winning.
All right, you can believe that if you want to, but
it's not a belief, right? Because we agree on this. It's
I know you believe that it's not a
it.
belief, right? I know you believe that, but what if the statists are actually just moral nihilists, right? You're just gonna say, I don't care. Right? I don't care that you're moral nihilist.
They can say that. They can They can go ahead and say, well, I don't actually care about the question of ethics, but then they're clearly not acting ethically, are they? They don't give a shit about ethics.
Well, I mean, to be clear, moral nihilism is
you cut out. I think you were going to say it's meta-ethical.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Right. So moral nihilism is actually a meta-ethical theory. So the statists, they could have their own ethical theories, but all they would really recognize is that the subjective beliefs that ethics are, they are not truth apt, they are not objectively verifiable, right?
But then they'd be contradicting themselves in that saying that they can't justify their ethics, but we can justify ours, right? So they've
objectively.
Hold on,
agreed. You said you're not a moral realist, but I mean, to me, you're speaking kind of like you believe in like objective
Well,
like
there
morality.
certainly are objectively real ethics. I just don't think all ethics can be objectively determined. I don't think that's true moral realism. I don't think there is an entire corpus of, every single ought. Either is that you ought to do it or ought not do it, right? I don't think every single ought is objectively determinable, right? So I'm not really a moral realist in that sense.
Well, I mean, to be clear, in philosophy, moral realism is just a position that, some moral propositions are truth apt, and some moral propositions are true.
In that sense, I would be a moral realist. Yes.
Yeah. It seems to me like you are actually a moral realist, to be honest. Yeah. Right. So I mean, that's where our disagreement lies. At least one big disagreement, which is that I am genuinely a moral nihilist. I would say that all moral propositions are non-truth apt.
I mean, we have it that there are these moral propositions where the negation of them, you can't propose them without contradiction.
That's the point. I would not apply the law of non-contradiction to
Right.
normative propositions.
Yeah, so then we're back at the rejection of classical. I don't know if we can go any further from that. We
Okay,
still have it
yeah,
that the only
I can see if I still have some criticism,
Yeah.
or if I've went through all of them already. Yeah, I've definitely went over that. I've went over that. I've went over that. Oh, this is a good one. So I think the action axiom makes it impossible for one to follow the nap when they would prefer to aggress, right? So if it were my preference to violate the nap, then the action axiom would state that I would violate, or at least attempt to violate, the nap. This makes virtue impossible because I would not have the ability to violate my preferences in favor of what would be ethical.
I don't think it makes virtue impossible. It makes it such that we're guiding actions here with fault being legal versus illegal. It's just saying that, well, you wouldn't have been able to choose otherwise than to commit a crime, but we at least know that it is criminal what you did, right? That's what we're getting at here. Action axiom makes it such that you couldn't not violate the NAP when you want to violate the NAP, but that doesn't mean that this is suddenly absolved of all ethical concerns. You've still done something which is wrong.
Right, and that's essentially my point, which is that, right, I mean, if I had the preference to violate the NAP, I mean, I just could not help myself. I could not.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I could not stop myself from violating the NAP, or at least trying.
Yeah, that's true, and this is why we need to concern ourselves with ethics, because that way you can properly guide your actions. You can decide, well, if I didn't understand ethics, then I might have done this, but I don't think you could say that you would do it, because I don't think you could really say how the world would be if you didn't understand ethics. But this is why you should engage in these. This is why I talk so much about ethics on my channel, because I want people to understand when they're being unethical.
Are you saying you want to change their preferences such that their preference is not going to be?
I would want to align their future scale of values such that they do care about ethical concerns when they're weighing decisions.
Right, so shape their preferences in such a way that their preferences would not be to violate the NAP.
Yeah, it might be the case, like, I don't think you could ever really determine this scientifically, but it might be the case that, some future subscriber of mine, in situation X, if I had never made any videos, they would go ahead and, rob a person, but then now that they understand that this is an evil thing to do, then they decide, well, no, I don't want to do that because it would be evil. I mean, I do this all the time when I'm weighing up whether I should do something, maybe one of my flatmates pisses me off, and I'm like, well, geez, I could, take their fucking olive oil or something. They have, olive oil in the kitchen. I could just use that for my cooking. And then I think, well, no, that would be an evil thing to do. I would be robbing them. So I'm not going to do that. This has actually happened to me. I have actually been pissed off at my flatmates and thought, right, I could very easily just, get back at them by taking their shit. But I'm like, no, that wouldn't be right. I'm not going to do that.
All right, I mean that's a good answer. I will accept it. So I have one last criticism here, and this is gonna be basically the opposite of what you just said, and this is gonna be
Very fun.
This is gonna be the self-interest argument. So, you know how there are some Christians who will like try to convert others to Christianity, but at the same time they will say that those who are not aware of Christianity, they will actually go to heaven. So they are actually doing them a disservice by like converting them into Christianity because they give them the option of like not getting to go to heaven, right? So I see a similar thing here where I think I'll be a better off as an egoist, serving my own self-interest than if I were to be converted to like some kind of libertarian ethics where I would like forego like that opportunity to further my own interests.
So this is why it's so important that law is embedded in ethics. And this is what the David Friedmanites get wrong. Is that I think it is in everyone's self-interest to always do non-criminal things. I think it is just a better way to go about life. I think that is always going to be in your self-interest. And, I'm not particularly well read on, the objectivism side of things, so I can't fully explicate why that's the case.
This is not objectivism. To be clear, this is not objectivism.
Right, oh, okay, yeah, sure. But the objectivists are big on self-interest as well. And I think they make an interesting point in self-interest in that you should always do ethical things. It's almost like I'm more of a stoic, so it's hard for me to kind of explain this because stoicism isn't really as embedded in the law as objectivism is. It's just that you are living a better life when you are being ethical. It's not a good life to go around raping and murdering people. I think that is not a good life. You should instead be non-criminal. It's better to be non-criminal. That is in your self-interest. It wouldn't be my self-interest to take my flatmate's stuff. That's not in my self-interest.
I mean, I could try like a hypothetical and try to ask you what if it were in your self-interest, right? I mean, I know you're gonna say it's not, but what if it were?
But that's like saying, well, what if it were the case that it's malformed, right? It's that it just isn't the case to me, right? I just don't think it's the case.
That's fine. That's fine. You don't have to answer that if you don't want to. I mean, that's perfectly fine. But that's basically like concludes my criticisms for now. And I mean, I have to say that I have had a lot of fun here, and it's been really awesome talking to you. To be honest, I mean, this went better.
Yeah.
And I expected kind of that we might end up like yelling at each other or something.
Nah. It was great. It's always the case when you have people who actually understand their position that you can have a proper, good faith exchange. Because I think we were both acting in good faith here. I don't think you are like some of my previous opponents where you just don't understand fucking anything about anything. I think you do understand a lot about a lot, right? And I think you'll make a good libertarian someday. If I can crack that shell of yours.
Well, I mean, I've been a libertarian before.
Yeah, I've seen your channel.
Okay, yeah. I've joined the dark side.
Yeah,
so to speak.
You're not a fucking dirty statist.
Well, I mean, I'm mostly a political nihilist, if anything, right? So I don't think the statism, anarchism dichotomy even like applies to me at this point.
I do actually have one question for you, which is completely unrelated to everything we talked about. You look to me like you're a Linux guy. Are you a Linux guy?
No, Windows.
Fuck. Yeah, The only
But
reason
I just buy what's cheap, to be honest.
the only reason I say this is because I think it's just entirely based on the fact that there is a Finnish Linux YouTuber, and I've just completely associated you and him in my mind.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Anyway, you should try out Linux, and it was good talking to you. Do you have anything more you want to say on the matter?
No, I think I've said everything I have to say.
Yeah, good talking to you, man. If you have any other disputes in the future, I'd love to talk to you again, and I'll see you later.
Yes, thank you very much, and see you.
See ya. Yeah, I completely agree with Casimir in the chat. This is a better conversation than most I have. Certainly better than that fucking Doolittle debate. That guy's a fucking retard. Yes, exactly, Valen. Proprietary bitch. That is the exact person I was thinking of. But yeah, if he really wants to be free and act in his self-interest, he should be on Linux. So yeah, I'll see you guys later. Make sure to watch that Doolittle debate. It was very fun. I ended up making fun of him for pissing himself at the end. And yeah. Boop.